So I took the theme of fineness, sensitivity, typography to essentially reflect what I'm always concerned with anyway, which is excellence and the details of typography. As somebody concerned with words, both as a reader and writer and as a graphic designer and book designer, both the meaning of the words, the sense of the words, and the way they look, I have always been concerned with the actual paragraph, the page, what we read, and how it works. To my mind, the main thing about typography, the most important part, is space. Space is what we are reading. It's all about the figure and ground, as you say in graphic design and in art. It is a matter of getting it right. And that, to me, is fineness and sensitivity in typography. There are a few other things as well, like placement, forms of contrast, and so forth. But space is the #1 important element in typography. So changing a font, changing a typeface, of course, changes the feel of the text very much and makes it easier or harder to read. But that's not the most important thing. It's how you treat that typeface. It is things like changing the space between lines, changing the space between words, changing the space between letters. That's a very important part, especially in a typeface. In a typeface like what you can't quite see on the screen at the moment, a Bodoni, which has very high contrast between thicks and thins. If you set it too tight, it's going to be hard to read. There we go. So it's all about the space within the letters, which is negative space, I suppose, but it's also, in a sense, what we read, the space around the letters, and the combination of the two, and how it works along a line. Now, this is true in any script, but I'm concentrating on the Latin script and English right here. We pay attention to the space as we read along. And of course, the amount of dark, the amount of black, the width of the strokes reduces the space. That's the reason why, counterintuitively, a heavier weight actually requires less space between letters. It seems as though it should be the other way around, but in fact, it's true. If it's a light weight, it needs to be spaced out more. There are a lot of digital fonts that we use where the lightweight has entirely too little space built into it, and you need to change that. Obviously, the shape of the letter, the style of the letter makes a difference in the shape of that space inside and the shape of the space outside. And similarly, very heavy letters, very heavy weights, have smaller amounts, but in a serif face, it can be more complex space inside, slightly more complex space outside. But this, I'm looking at the Latin alphabet. That's my expertise, but of course, that's not all we have. India is an obvious example, and everything we heard yesterday emphasizes how difficult it is, both in India and elsewhere, to deal with the relations between different scripts and the spaces. How does that work in a script that is not just letters like the Latin alphabet? So I did a little bit of looking at the space. What is the space? What is the counter space in different scripts? Well, it's not always easy to tell. And of course, as in here, it makes a difference, the width, the heaviness of the strokes. But what exactly is the counter space in that bottom character on the right? In this Arabic letter, this one is very obvious. That's the interior. What's the interior of this letter? My friend Dr. Mamoun Sakal sent me this this illustration of different ways of spacing in Arabic. There is no tracking in Arabic, basically, but there are ways. There's the kashida, which is used to extend a line to fill out space if you're justifying. And this is from calligraphy, so it's not just from typesetting. This is, in fact, a handwritten poem. There's also certain letters that can be extended on their own, and there are ways of changing space, but not at all like you would do typesetting in English, say. And obviously, the space makes things readable. It depends on where you are looking at something from. This signage from Yokohama in Japan, the Japanese presumably is fairly easy to read from a distance as you walk up to this sign pole. The English is nice to have, since I don't read Japanese, but is not so easy to read. Light, all caps, of course it's smaller, it is the secondary, there's no question about that. But it's also a bit tight to read. This lovely old lettering from Brighton in England is pretty tight for reading, but it's lovely to look at. As I said, it depends on where you are looking at it from, how big it is. These gigantic letters on architectural elements of the Seattle Public Library are more decorative than informative, but they're also informative. When your signage, literal signage on like these numbers on the building at Microsoft, or some of their wayfinding system if you're driving around, that depends on where you're looking at it from. This older version is not only set in artificially squashed Times New Roman with very poor spacing, but it's set at an angle. So this is actually what you see if you drive into this little driveway in front of the building. Not very effective for actually reading it and figuring out where you are or where you want to go. And you'll note that they didn't bother to use the ligature, FI ligature in briefing in the last line. Just thoughtless. So where are you looking at the typography from? A label in an art museum, you'll usually have to peer at it up close, even though the art, of course, you want to look at from a great distance. The spacing on this sign on the bus shuttle at Microsoft looks rather loose when you're looking at it standing right behind it, but it's designed to be seen as the shuttle goes zooming by. It's actually perfectly spaced for its purpose. This sign in Seattle I find particularly well spaced for reading across the street like this. This is what it looks like up front. I understand they're about to change the name of this organization, and probably the new signs will be typically unreadable. So where do you see it from? Where are you looking at it from? You can tell that right here in this room. Some of you are looking at these screens fairly straight on. Some of you are looking at them at an angle. Yesterday, when one of them went out, some of you had to look at an extreme angle. That's all about how it works, how the effective space works. The effective space has to do with the distance from the page or the screen or the building side or whatever you are reading from. And the rest has to do with the actual size and the angle. So typography is about rhythm of shapes. This is all Latin alphabet here. This is just exercises that type designers often use for deciding how to build in the space in their fonts. The straight characters, the round characters, but it makes a difference what the actual shape is. It's not just a monoline concept of a shape, it's the actual outlines. And the spacing matters, and it depends not just on the shape, but if you take all the space out, you begin to see things like the top line, and even to some extent the bottom line, look more like links of chain than a series of O's. Another example of just how the different letter forms make a difference in the shape and the spacing. And lowercase is a little more complicated, but the same principle applies. And if the shape of the letters can enforce or allow, or unenforce essentially, spacing that can be a little too tight for comfort in words that don't, well, depending on the letters, that don't lend themselves to good spacing. Spacing is what the typographer does. This illustration by Michael Harvey is a rather flamboyant illustration of space between letters. These are all his own lettering. But it doesn't matter what style you're doing, you have to think about how they fit together, how they're read. Obviously, if they're all, well, not obviously, if they're all capital letters, they need to be more loosely spaced than all lowercase letters, because the capitals in the Latin alphabet are spaced for use with a lowercase, so they fit properly there. If they're all together, first of all, they're all a more even shape. The word is more even shape, and they're simply a little too tight, especially at a light weight. If you do what many overzealous kerners do, you squeeze all the space out as though you're squeezing air out between letters. That first line of illuminate shows how unreadable that can be. The bottom line shows how unreadable it can be if you space it out so far that it no longer hangs together as a word. And all too often, in English, in Latin alphabet, in Western languages, it's too common to let the program letter space to justify, which is easy to do and ugly and distracting to a reader. Because, for instance, those 3 words on 3 typographics are all different lengths. Usually you don't have the same word right above it and below it in the next line, but sometimes you do. And the whole point of this spacing is to make it easier for the reader, not easy for the typesetter, not easy for the designer. Even if it's not justified, you end up with really awkward things that need to be fixed by hand. That's what my friend Ole Cavern calls walking the lines. After you typeset something, you go back and look at it line by line and see. That's somewhat what InDesign's paragraph composer does, what used to be called the multi-line composer. It's a very good piece of software, but still, you need your own eye when you're composing. So a page can be densely populated with text or very lightly, but it's also a matter of thinking about, again, as a designer, this is what this page spread looks like when I'm designing it on my computer. This is what it looks like when it's printed in a book. You have to remember that it's going to be opening out. It's a physical object. It's not the lovely spread on the screen. We have to think about gutters in books. You have to know how the book, if it's a book, you need to know how it's going to be bound. Even a magazine, today, at least in the United States, there's a very strong tendency to perfect bind every magazine. It's one of the great misnomers of the world, perfect binding, because it's actually a very poor system, cutting off the edges of the page and gluing them straight into a flat back. That means it can never open flat. But that's the trend even for magazines that are so thin that they wouldn't need that. There's no necessity for it. So there are different ways to design pages, some using space in interesting ways. This is space not in the text typography, although that is part of it, but space on the page and arrangement. On this particular book page, I had that epigraph to deal with, and it was a 2-column design. I could have just had it in the first column, and that would have worked. But I realized that it actually worked across the 2 columns. It's short enough that that very, very long line isn't going to be a problem. You're not going to double back because it's just a very short piece. So it worked in this case. It's a matter of working with the parameters of what you have. And it's true no matter what language you're dealing with. The text of this book, which is about Microsoft's ClearType font collection, which I did about 10 years ago, is in English, but this particular part is about Meiryo, the typeface designed for Japanese. And you can't, of course, see them on the scripts. Once you get the letters get very small or get on a screen with poor resolution, you begin to lose things. You literally begin to have everything squashing together. That is a type design problem and a rendering problem and a question of designing for the medium. But we mostly have the fonts today for screen publishing. They exist. Much effort has been put into them, including in non-Latin scripts. In Meiryo, for instance, the kanji, the very complex characters, the Chinese-based characters, they deliberately used, Eiichi Kono, who designed it, deliberately used an algorithm, or sort of an algorithm, a pre-digital algorithm that was in the calligraphic tradition, that you could drop certain strokes if you were simplifying to draw, to write in a very simplified way. So by following that tradition in how to lose strokes when it got very, very small on screen, it became more readable than it would have been with some other system for a native speaker. At least that is what I was told. I do not read Japanese. Space and arrangement and what Carl Dare called the different kinds of contrast are important for organizing information. But the basic paragraph, which is just straight text, is what we read. It's how we communicate to each other and to ourselves. It's all about the complex interaction of the typeface itself, the size, the leading, the line length, the word space, kerning, tracking, all of that. And as you change those, it changes the readability, and they have to work together. This is the same paragraph in 3 different settings, where all the parameters have been changed together. So, space. If you don't have space, it gets unreadable. Some digital fonts have over-enthusiastic kerning pairs, such as apostrophe S, which is common in English as a possessive, and you end up with bliss. Certain combinations of letters depends on the arrangement, depends on the order, what is going to actually look right. So the bottom line is spaced out, not only because it's more readable for all caps, a lightweight like this to be spaced out, but that it's easier to adjust and get all of the spacing to work right. We've all seen what happens when you just jam things together, like the TAV there. Or this, I wish I had had a camera when I saw this. I recreated, this was the Meridian Hotel logo that I saw somewhere, and I was looking up at it, so I had a great bad angle. It says Meridian, but it looks like it's a German plural of a French rude word. So, as I said, space. Space and the space underneath and the character stroke on top. The same font can be used entirely different ways. This is Gerard Unger's Typeface Gulliver, which he designed for newspapers. Gulliver is a very elegant and compact face, but this is a page from USA Today, not a current page. I think it's been redesigned at least a couple of times since then, where they actually squeezed it slightly optically and used negative leading, or I would say negative leading. It's a typeface with a very large X height, and squeezed it together to the point where, to me, this is uninviting. I never wanted to read this paragraph at all. Of course, it's not a newspaper I would normally read, but that's a different question. It's good to see well-designed newspapers even when they're not ones you want to read. This is exactly the same typeface in a German newspaper, which is much more serious. It is not squeezed. It is, in fact, I believe the tracking is very slightly looser than the default, and it's just generally treated differently. So, same typeface. Everything about the treatment, mostly space. The one difference being this is very slightly condensed. Makes all the difference. Just for contrast, this is a page, very bad image, but a page from Giambattista Bodoni's book, typographic book, just showing how Bodoni spaced his own lettering and a text page. And this kind of question comes up in other scripts too. This is a page from a modern Armenian book set in a digital font. This is an old style handheld reading device, a little tiny book, a prayer book from Mexico, 18th century. And I think in some ways it is a template for reading on your phone. It's about the same size. The letters are large. Of course, you don't have show-through on your phone from the back of the page. But it is all about space and type, whether it's metal type like this, or this is a page from a Kindle book in the Kindle app on an iPhone. Poorly spaced, but using, I believe, Georgia, a decent font. This is actually Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, a free copy, so it did not have a lot of design attention given to it. That 9 in the middle would be a note if it were a properly designed page. The space is terrible, all kinds of bad spacing in this page. But if you really want to read the book, and Gibbon is remarkably readable, you will put up with anything. This is what that page, or a different page from the same book, looked like when there was a glitch of some sort and the font didn't show up. All Courier. Horrible, horrible. You could hardly imagine a worse piece of typography as page. But if you really want to read the book, you will read it anyway. But that is not a service to the author. If you're a book designer, you want a page designer, you want to design a page that will invite people to read, not put them off. So, we're designing for screens. We're designing for small screens. We're designing for our phones, laptops, tablets. How do you deal with space in that area. It's a very small space. You obviously need some margins, otherwise it looks like this. You need not too much, or you have almost nothing, and this is not even justified. The relationships of the spaces are just as complex and just as detailed on screen as they are on the page, but they're harder to control. If I were designing just a fixed page for a screen, a PDF designed for a particular size and orientation, that's easy. But something that actually works the way we use our digital devices, that's harder, because the first thing a reader does is say, oh, I want the font bigger. Well, that changes everything, doesn't it? It changes all the parameters I was talking about earlier. And I would like to see tools invented, created, and used, and available for controlling that as intelligently and complexly for an adaptive, dynamic page as we have now with InDesign and other programs to control a printed page. I've been talking about this for several years and advocating this, and it keeps changing. It keeps changing on the base, week by week it changes. So it doesn't stand still, but we still have very few tools. I used to say it felt like 1985 in the desktop publishing revolution. Now it might begin to feel like, say, fall of 1986. Still, we don't have the tools, we have all the possibilities, and we have mostly very hard to read text on screen, which is why most people will say, oh, I can't read a book on screen. I couldn't do that. It's not usually because it's not readable on screen. It's because the typography sucks. Also because they probably mean I can't do it sitting at my desk looking at a desktop monitor, which is not the ideal way to read a book. In any case, you wouldn't put your printed book up on your desk in a cookbook reader and try to read it that way. So, space, dynamic space, changing space. I think it's very important to keep demanding better typography, both on paper and on the screen, and to practice great typography. This is my favorite picture of the late Jan Schickhold, one of my great favorite typographers. You can't quite tell whether you're saying, that's just right, or if he's saying, would you move it just a smidgen to the left? So I started an institute, which I must admit is still mostly me, Scripta Institute, to try to be an advocate for better typography in reading on screen. If you're interested, this is the website, and or send me an email. I invite you to invent the tools or the techniques or the typography that we need now. Thank you.